Chelsea Manning is an American hero. That much is indisputable. If you disagree, I'd like you to try the following exercise. Take a standard garbage can and bring it out to the curb or wherever your garbage is collected, and then what I want you to do is I want you to climb inside the garbage can and wait for the garbage truck to pick you up because you're garbage and you live at the dump now. Chelsea Manning is also in jail, and has been since May 17th. Furthermore, a week prior to her arrest, she'd also been in jail for a further 62 days, about half of which she spent in solitary confinement, which, just so you know, is torture, and we will get to why a little bit later in the video. Each day that she spends in prison adds another $1,000 to the fee she is being charged, now totaling over $30,000. She has lost her home, she has no way of making money, and will likely be submerged in debt for the rest of her natural life. These types of fees are usually reserved for large corporations, and I think it's worth taking a moment to point out that Chelsea Manning is not a corporation. She is, in fact, a human woman. The courts have justified these fines by pointing out that Manning has a public speaking career, which I assume they must think is very lucrative. But it's actually really difficult to make a living from public speaking when you are detained and kept from the public, who you might want to speak to. And look, there are thousands of people being jailed for all sorts of spurious reasons in the United States right now. There are literal concentration camps where children are being separated from their parents and jailed right now. The mass incarceration of black people in the United States is one of the greatest injustices in human history. Over 2.2 million people are behind bars in the United States, representing 22% of the world's prison population. Roughly 0.7% of the American population is behind bars at this moment. Which, just to drive home that statistic, that's a little bit more than 1 in 200 people. All of that represents the people who are in prison at this second, and not the total amount of people who will spend time in prison during their lifetime. However, it's still worth talking about this case in particular, and the frankly authoritarian way that it is being pursued. Chelsea Manning's detainment demonstrates the lie at the heart of Western liberal democracy, the idea that the rule of law is designed to protect citizens like you, and lays bare the way that it in fact primarily protects the existing oligarchical power structure. Manning was born December 17, 1987 in Oklahoma City. She was assigned male at birth and struggled throughout her childhood through to early adulthood with gender dysphoria. In 2007, her Navy SEAL father convinced her to join the military in order to get money for college. In 2009, she was deployed to Iraq. Chelsea had a difficult time adjusting to military life. She was bullied by other soldiers for being short, or being perceived as gay, or mentally ill. She tried many times to be discharged. All attempts were denied. A decision I'm sure that a lot of military brass sure regret now. She grew increasingly disillusioned with the war in Iraq and her place in the army. As a big old nerd with a lifelong passion for computers, Chelsea became an intelligence analyst and was granted top-secret security clearance. Here's the part of the story you probably remember from when CNN talked about it or some shit. She sent highly confidential logs to WikiLeaks, representing the largest leak in American military history. And there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not that was acceptable, whether or not it was dangerous. And pretty much anyone who sucks will tell you that she's a traitor, that she somehow put American soldiers in danger, or at the very least, potentially could have. Of course, we can't tell you how exactly. That's a matter of national security. You just have to trust the military on this one, bud. A lot of this stuff was just too dangerous to release, and they're not just mad because Chelsea exposed some of their wrongdoings. No, it's for safety. You take our word on this one. Okay. Well, how about this thought slime? Some of the material from the leak was found on Osama bin Laden's computer in his compound, making this potentially as dangerous to national security as other materials on his computer, like, for example, New Super Mario Bros., or Ice Age: Dawn of the Dinosaurs, or a copy of this early viral video about how Charlie bit that kid's finger. The controversy around Manning often focuses on the hypothetical. What do these events represent? What kind of precedent was set by these events? What is lost in this analysis, deliberately, are the facts of the matter. It's a lot easier to condemn Manning based on potentialities than realities, because when you look at what she actually leaked, you see monstrous actions by the US military, and it becomes clear that all of their attempts to paint Manning as a traitor are just damage control. Here's just a sample of some of the data that was provided by Manning's leaks. The civilian death toll in Iraq was underreported to the tune of 15,000 more civilian deaths than the military had acknowledged. To quote The Guardian, U.S. authorities failed to investigate hundreds of reports of abuse, torture, rape, and even murder by Iraqi police and soldiers whose conduct appears to be systematic and normally unpunished. 700 civilians, including pregnant women and the mentally ill, had been killed for getting too close to checkpoints. Perhaps most damningly, a video of an Apache helicopter opening fire on 8 civilians, including 2 journalists from Reuters. The helicopter crew laugh and joke around. Its crew pleads to open fire on a van that showed up to help one of the wounded men, which they then received, and shot up the van, killing the man who was just driving by and stopped to help someone who was bleeding to death on the street, and injuring his 2 small children, who he was driving to a tutoring session. One of the soldiers scoffs and says, well, it's their fault, bringing their kids to a battle. Battle here, meaning an unprompted airstrike against civilians. When you actually look at the material that Manning leaked, it becomes very difficult to bloviate about what a horrible traitor she is. She blew the whistle on terrible crimes and abuses of power. Any claim that she should have done so through legal military channels willfully ignores that much of the material itself concerns how readily those channels ignore that information in the first place. If you're going to try and say that she put American soldiers' lives at risk, firstly, soldiers in active combat are always at risk. To some degree, being a soldier in combat means accepting a certain amount of risk. Secondly, there was, quote, no significant strategic impact to the release of this information, according to those hippy-dippy peaceniks over at the Pentagon. But it's not all good news. According to The Guardian, quote, the authors of the Pentagon report were also worried about the impact of adverse media publicity accruing from the leak. In particular, they were anxious about media attention on the large number of Iraqi and Afghan civilians who were being injured or killed in the US war effort. See, you gotta look at it from their perspective. Do you have any idea how bad it makes them look when their murders are revealed? Do you ever think of that? Chelsea Manning's only crime was showing the world the hideous realities of the war in Iraq, and also violating the Espionage Act, which she was court-martialed for and sentenced to 35 years in prison. None of the war criminals she exposed were even charged. Her sentence was commuted by President Obama in late 2017, and she was released from prison having only served 4 years of her sentence. 9 months of that 4 years was spent in solitary confinement. So let's talk about solitary confinement and what it does to a person. But first, a word from someone who did not sponsor this video. Do you like to suck on things? This is a pretty good segue, right? Check out Suck My Opinion, a democratic socialist propaganda YouTube channel. Here's a neat little coincidence. When I do these fake ads, I like to look through the project or whatever I'm promoting and find something that I think my audience would respond to. And when I did this for Suck My Opinion, the video that I landed on was titled, Does Toxic Masculinity Help Capitalism? And when I double-checked the email that they had sent me, I realized, oh yeah, they had actually asked me to highlight that one. So I guess great minds think alike. You can find links to Suck My Opinion's channel page and that video in the description below. Slight housekeeping note, demand for the non-sponsorship segment on this program has far exceeded capacity. I can't highlight all of the projects people send my way, so please don't take it as a reflection on the quality of your work if I highlight someone else instead of you. That being said, if you need those precious eyeballs, email me at thoughtslimeeditor@gmail.com and I'll see what I can do. And now back to the show! Segregation, isolation, separation, cellular, lockdown, supermax, the whole, secure housing unit, whatever the name, solitary confinement should be banned by states as a punishment or extortion technique. Solitary confinement is a harsh measure which is contrary to rehabilitation, the aim of the penitentiary system. Solitary confinement, as a punishment, cannot be justified for any reason, precisely because it imposes severe mental pain and suffering beyond any reasonable retribution for criminal behavior, and thus constitutes an act defined as torture. But of course, you think that, Thought Slime? You're bleeding heart lefty pinko, I bet you want to give hugs to all the criminals. Of course you think it's cruel and unusual to put them in solitary. You're not an expert on torture, like Juan Mendez, the United Nations expert on torture, who actually said those things. And here's a telling coincidence. I was looking for some authoritative quotes about solitary confinement, and in the article where I found those quotes from Mr. Mendez, it also had this. Mr. Mendez told a news conference that he had been following the case of U.S. soldier Chelsea Manning, detained in connection with her alleged leaking of secret cables to the WikiLeaks website. Ms. Manning was held in solitary confinement for 8 months, but has now been moved and is no longer subject to the same restrictions. Now, I made a few barely noticeable corrections to that, but the point still stands. Solitary confinement can cause those subject to it to hallucinate, to become seriously depressed, to develop compulsive behavior, to self-mutilate. To quote PBS Frontline, a 1995 study of the federal prison system found that 63% of suicides occurred among inmates locked in special housing status, such as solitary or in psychiatric seclusion cells. As one inmate cited in the study explained, the hole and segregation cells are depressing enough to drive many men to take their lives in order to escape. For some, it would appear to be the only way out. After years of living in the cramped confines of a segregation cell with no hope of getting out, it is easy to see why a man would prefer death. Solitary confinement does perhaps irreversible damage to the human mind. The effects of isolation not only contribute to depression and increased levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, they can actually reduce cognitive ability. In an article for Scientific American, Stephanie Cacioppo, I'm trying, an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral neuroscience at the University of Chicago, said, "We see solitary confinement as nothing less than a death penalty by social deprivation." They cite the example of activist Robert King, who spent decades in solitary confinement for a crime he did not commit. King has experienced, quote, lasting cognitive changes from his time in solitary confinement. His memory is impaired, and he has lost his ability to navigate, both of which are signs of damage to the hippocampus. At one point, he was unable to recognize faces, but that problem has passed. End quote. Solitary confinement is particularly dangerous for the mentally ill. Isolation can exacerbate mood disorders like depression, as can the disruptions in circadian rhythm caused by decreased exposure to sunlight. I mention this because Manning had a history of such mood disorders, which the military and prison system were no doubt aware of when they decided to put her in solitary. To put it bluntly, this is criminally negligent, but sadly is all too common. Take a moment to consider the trauma of this. Consider how it must feel to be held 23 hours a day for 8 months in a prison cell about the size of a small horse stable, no windows, just a small slot where food can be shoved through, no conversation, no stimulus of any kind. But you get out. And a little while after that, the president himself intervenes and commutes your sentence. Lo and behold, you have your freedom back. That feeling that's been weighing you down, that your life is over, that there's nothing left for you, that at any moment you could be thrown back into torturous isolation and left to die, that's gone. Once you had escaped that, what would you be willing to do to avoid going back? Few people on Earth have had their mettle tested like that. This February, Chelsea was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury against WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Sadly, having already been convicted, Manning cannot invoke her Fifth Amendment right to refuse self-incrimination, and thus has no legal grounds to refuse to testify. An ordinary person would have just submitted to the process, but Chelsea Manning is not an ordinary person. She said, quote, "I object strenuously to this subpoena and to the grand jury process in general. We've seen this power abused countless times to target political speech. I have nothing to contribute to this case, and I resent being forced to endanger myself by participating in this predatory practice." The guts of this is difficult to overstate. This is a woman who has faced severe state repression and escaped it by the skin of her teeth, and then, on the strength of her convictions, was willing to risk facing them again rather than betray her principles. She was held in contempt of court and jailed in the Federal Detention Center in Alexandria, Virginia. She was held in administrative segregation, i.e. solitary confinement, for 28 days before being released into Gen Pop. She was released in May when the grand jury dissolved, and then immediately served with another subpoena to testify before another grand jury, and again refused. She is currently once again imprisoned for the duration of this grand jury investigation, which could be up to 18 months. She was given a penalty fine of $500 a day for the first 30 days and $1,000 a day thereafter. She is standing strong even now. She will not be compelled to participate with a grand jury.
Jails and prisons exist as a dark stain on our society, with more people confined in the US than anywhere else in the world. During my time, I spent 28 days in solitary confinement, a traumatic experience that I already endured for a year in prison before. Only a few months before reincarceration, I received gender confirmation surgery. This left my body vulnerable to injury and infection, leading to possible complications that I'm now seeking treatment for. The truth is, the government can construct no prison worse than to betray my own conscience and my principles.
That is what grace under pressure looks like. Firstly, and most obviously, you can contribute to her legal defense fund, link in the description. Any revenue on this video in the first month will be donated to that fund. Secondly, if you're in the United States, oof, that sucks. But you should write to each and every one of your political representatives, your congressperson, your governor, write to your fucking dog catcher if you think it'll make a difference. Obviously, politicians don't give a shit about political prisoners, so it's our jobs to keep their feet to the fire until such time that we can make do without them. Thirdly, write Chelsea a letter. She could use the emotional support. I'm going to send her a letter with some of the nicest comments I receive in this video. So if you'd like to get in on that, just @ Chelsea in the comments section. Instructions for how to write her are on the same page as the Legal Defense Fund, linked in the description. As we descend further and further into the authoritarian hell world we find ourselves in, it becomes imperative to stand up for people like Chelsea who push back. The more Chelseas we have, the more Chelseas we cultivate, the more likely we are to create a world worth living in. Oh boy, this one wasn't very funny, was it? Come here for jokes and you get this. You're welcome, it's kind of a bummer. Kind of a bummer. Oopsie daisies. Can't always be fun times, you know what I mean? Sometimes people are jailed for bad reasons. Hey, look up, what are you seeing on the screen? That's a bunch of my patrons who gave me money at patreon.com/thoughtslime. And I love each and every one of them like a child. I am like a parent to all of these children, and I love each and every one of them so much. I also have a Ko-fi link in the description that you can give one-time donations to if you're so inclined. Obviously, please don't give to the Patreon or the Ko-fi account if you're unable to. I feel the need to continuously stress that. I live stream every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can come check me out there doing that. At some point, I will do a follow-up where I read the letter to you guys with all the cool comments, and we can all enjoy that together before I send it off. But enough about me. What are you doing? What's new with you? Say it out loud to your screen right now, and I'll hear it. I'll hear it when you say it. Believe it or not, I can hear what anyone says to me, to any of my videos. I can always hear it.